მოგესალმებით.
დავიწყოთ ხო შეკიკა?
კი.
Welcome everybody. I'm Inga Diakonidze, Head of International Relations Department of Guram Tavarkiladze Tbilisi Teaching University. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you that you have found the time and joined us. Let me introduce our lecturer, who really did a big favor to us by agreeing to participate and deliver the masterclass and share his experience. Please meet Mr. Jorn van Rij, Senior Intelligence Officer of Netherlands National Police. We are very proud that Mr. Jorn is an honorable doctor of Guram Tavarkiladze Tbilisi Teaching University, and we are equally proud that he is a great friend of us. Our friendship started earlier in Holland University. This university is also a long-term partner of Guram Tavarkiladze Tbilisi Teaching University. And I'd also like to mention that we had the honor to host Mr. Jorn at our university as an exchange professor with the Erasmus Plus Mobility Project. And I'd also like to mention that we have special guest today, Mr. Gogi Gacharia, Police Attaché to the Kingdom of Netherlands and Head of Georgian Liaison Bureau in Europol. On behalf of our university, I'd like to express my gratitude that you have found the time and joined us today. And now a little bit about our working format. Mr. Jorn van Rij will deliver the lecture, and then the participants will have the possibility to answer the questions. Our lecturer is ready to communicate and answer all your questions. Dear Jorn, now if you are not against, I will greet all the participants in Georgian as well.
No problem.
მოგესალმებით, გმადლობთ რომ დაინტერესდით ჩვენი ლექციით და შემოგვიერთდით სხვადასხვა უმაღლესი სასწავლო დაწესებულებებიდან და ორგანიზაციებიდან. ჩვენი სამუშაო ფორმატი როგორც აღნიშნეთ შემდეგნაირია, ბატონი იორნ van Rij წაიკითხავს ლექციას ტრეფიკინგის თემაზე და შემდეგ ის მზადყოფნას გამოთქვამს, რომ უპასუხოს თქვენს მიერ დასმულ ყველა შეკითხვას. დიდი მადლობა კიდევ ერთხელ. Thank you once more. Now, Mr. Jorn, we are all attention. You can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Inga, for the nice introduction. So welcome, everybody. I'll start sharing my screen so that everybody can see my PowerPoint, and it should work.
Yeah, we can see it, Jorn.
Yeah, can you see it in big as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I see.
So I hope that my welcome in Georgian is okay and readable. If it's not, then I made a mistake. So I'm sorry for that then. So my lecture.
Yes, it's quite okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So my lecture for now will be on new steps in eradicating human trafficking. As mentioned by Inga, I'm working for the Netherlands National Police as a senior researcher and a senior intelligence officer for the unit on The Hague, mostly orientating towards fighting human trafficking, more specific, the sexual exploitation of Eastern European women. And my presentation will be on new ways and new possibilities to fight human trafficking with a specific focus on the Georgian situation. So I'll be going more in depth into the situation in Georgia as well. So talking about human trafficking, we see that the year of 2000 was a very important year in the way we think about not only human trafficking, but also about prostitution. So human trafficking is internationally defined in Article 3 of the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the UN Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, and Article 2 of Directive 2011/36 EU of the European Parliament on the prevention and combating trafficking in human beings and its victims. So by thinking about these two definitions, you can see a lot of similarities between the two of them. And that's because they were set up around the same period of time where the EU used a lot of information out of the UN definition. So looking at the two definitions at the same time, we can see, I'm sorry for that. We can actually see that it's a very large and extensive article working on human trafficking, and I won't address it in full because I think it's too much to actually do so in a lecture like this. But a specific focus there is on the D, where you have a specific focus on children, for example, and there is a mention of vulnerability and a mention of exploitation, which I will address later on as well. This can all be found online if you just put in Article 3 UN Protocol to Prevent, then it will pop up by itself, and then you can read it if you're interested. So Article 2 of the EU Directive is a little bit more extensive, but in the basics has the same elements as the UN focus. And what you see happening there is that this directive was set out in 2011. Before that, we had the UN protocol. The interesting thing about the directive of 2011 is the explanation of exploitation, which goes a little bit more in depth than that of the UN protocol. So thinking about these two articles, thinking about the international approach towards human trafficking, there are a number of set conditions which constitute the basics of human trafficking. First of all, there needs to be a situation of vulnerability. And this is laid down in paragraph 2 of Article 2 of the directive. And it actually says that vulnerability is a situation in which the person concerned has no real or acceptable alternative but to submit to the abuse involved. Now, just reading through this definition of vulnerability, it's multi-layered. It's a very difficult thing to grasp, actually, vulnerability, because thinking about vulnerability, we think about, for example, a weaker position towards the one who wants to exploit you. But this weaker position can be engaged through different means. So you can have a family position where, for example, your parents force you to do something, but this can also be an economic position where you have no financial means to make a living, and therefore you are submitted to somebody else's will. And from that position of vulnerability, we can cross over to the concept of exploitation. And exploitation has been laid down in paragraph 3 of the EU Directive. And it says that exploitation is prostitution or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, including begging, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the exploitation of criminal activities, or the removal of organs. So basically, in these 4 sentences, you have a lot of different ways in how human trafficking can take place. So we have prostitution as being one of the foremost types of exploitation. Then we have other types of sexual exploitation, which is a very difficult concept. Then we have forced labor, and this also includes begging. But begging in itself is also a difficult concept because in most European countries, begging is taken on board in the criminal code and is already punishable by law before that. So then we have somewhat a more or less type of criminal exploitation, which also occurs more and more nowadays. Then we have slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the exploitation of criminal activities. There you have it again. So that's the difficulty with the begging part, or the removal of organs. So going through these 2 definitions, we see 3 core elements. And these 3 core elements are laid down in paragraph 2 of the directive. And these core elements are actually the what, the actual act which needs to be committed. So that is recruiting a person to become a victim of human trafficking, or transporting a person to become a victim, transferring a person, harboring a person, or receiving a person. Then next to the act, so the what, we have the how, so how it's being done. So you can threaten somebody, you can force somebody, you can coerce somebody. We have seen cases of abduction, fraud, and deception, so that somebody thinks that they're going to be doing one thing and it proves to be that they have to do another thing. And then finally, we have the purpose, and that's actually the why. And the why is always the exploitation part. So they make use of the vulnerability in the end to exploit a person. So exploitation is sexual exploitation, forced slavery, and slavery-like practices. And then you have the rest I've just mentioned. So these are the ways how the abuse actually consists out of, and what is needed in a legal case to be proven by the state against the one who is being a suspect of human trafficking. And this is a very difficult thing to actually prove within court, and that's why human trafficking remains one of the crimes with the highest impunity in the world, which makes it very difficult because we know it's $1 billion business worldwide, and opposite to, for example, cocaine trafficking, which is much more lucrative, so much more profitable than human trafficking. Human trafficking is profitable in the sense that it's a reoccurring crime. So you can keep abusing a victim over and over again, while cocaine can only be sold once. So it's a quick profit, one-time deal, and a victim of human trafficking will keep earning money for the traffickers itself. So then we're going to be looking at the purpose. So we're going to be looking at the final element, the why. Why are we going to be doing this? So that's the exploitation. So legally, as mentioned before, it said the exploitation of the prostitution of others, other forms of sexual exploitation and forced labor or services, and then the entire line I just mentioned. So first of all, prostitution. Prostitution is a very clear concept. So this basically means the selling and buying of sexual services. And I've mentioned the year 2000 as being an important year, also thinking about human trafficking, but also thinking about prostitution, because around 2000 was the year that our three mainstream thoughts on prostitution policy were really evolved and taken on board as state policy. So we have three main thoughts. So we have prohibition, as we see in the United States, which actually forbids prostitution, and everybody involved is punishable by law. So the women selling sex, the men buying sex, and the pimps behind the selling of sex, they're all punishable by law, and everybody who earns money out of it is punishable by law. Then we have the so-called Swedish model, which has now become the Nordic model, which actually says that all women involved in prostitution are a victim, and therefore they should not be punishable by law. And all the men buying sex are actually the ones who are providing the crime, and therefore they should be punishable by law, same as the pimps responsible for the actual exploitation of the women. And then we have, for example, the Dutch-German model, which regulates prostitution. So prostitution is allowed and legal within a certain set of limitations. So you have to be an adult. It has to be voluntary. And there are other conditions like paying taxes and registering yourself and cooperating with authorities and so on. So those are the set conditions under which prostitution can take place. So not all prostitution in the Netherlands is legal. So thinking about the why, thinking about prostitution, but all the other types of sexual exploitation, then we have to think about the actual acts committed. So the human behavior which is visible within the exploitation to actually identify the victims and the criminal acts. Because talking about prostitution, of course, it's very difficult to assess by just viewing the situation if it's a victim of trafficking or just a voluntarily working prostitute in the Netherlands, for example. So how do we actually know when we're talking about human trafficking and when we're not talking about human trafficking? And this is one of the key areas in which we have to identify those victims. And this is very difficult, actually. So we also see that a lot of the victims are not very willing to cooperate with the authorities. And this has a couple of reasons. For example, they have been told by the traffickers that the police is their enemy, that they cannot cooperate with the police because the police will steal their money, beat them up, rape them, or anything else. So there's a misconcept about the situation of the police. Another situation could be that the position they are in right now is actually better than the position they came out of. So, for example, a Romanian prostitute having to work in the town of Galați, working on street, which is a very dangerous type of prostitution, are being forced to work without a condom, without protection, working for like €5 per customer, and is now working in the Netherlands, earning €50 a customer, having security of a window, still not upholding Dutch labor rights, but for her the situation is much better. By going or talking to the police, for example, she will give that up. She doesn't know what will happen. She doesn't know the next step. She doesn't know what services we can offer her to protect her and get her into a better position and exit prostitution. So this is very difficult to gain trust with the victims. And therefore, it's very difficult to actually get information about the type of trafficking and what's actually occurring within the trafficking. So it's very, very, very difficult to actually get grasp of the why. It seems so easy talking about prostitution, talking about sexual exploitation, but in fact, it's very difficult to prove that there has been a case of sexual exploitation, for example. And within the sexual exploitation, we can also talk about strip clubs, lap dance clubs and stuff like that. So it's much more than we just think of. And this is a live stream through Facebook. So thinking about sexual exploitation, this can also be online, of course. So we've had the COVID-19 lockdowns. Everybody went online and we all watched clips from girls, who knows doing what. And you actually don't know which country they're in. And you're just paying through a secure server. And you probably wouldn't even have known that some of these women were probably forced to do this line of job. And we also see this happening on sites like Pornhub, where you can upload pornographic materials. We actually don't know how many of these girls or young men are actually being forced within these acts. We just watch the video, we just watch the clip, and we just don't think about it. So this makes it very difficult to actually identify possible victimization. So talking about the sexual exploitation, to clarify it a little bit, I always use the definition by Suzanne Edwards, and she states that sexual exploitation is a practice by which persons achieve sexual gratification or financial gain or advancement through the abuse of a person's sexuality by abrogating that person's human right to dignity, equality, autonomy, and physical and mental well-being. So in short, this basically covers everything. So you abuse somebody's sexuality to make money. And this can be on many different layers, prostitution only being one. So when we start thinking about these acts, so the why on human trafficking, we see a lot of new challenges arriving. So we always think about prostitution as being the most standard, but there are many other ways in which human trafficking can occur. So more and more we get new insights in typologies of human trafficking. And this year I finished a book chapter on, for example, Russia's private military forces, the so-called Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group is a private military contractor working for the Russian government, and they actually solicit young men from the countryside who live in a deprived situation with no economic prospect, with no education, and they offer them a position within the Russian military. Actually, these young men are not becoming part of the normal Russian military, but they start working for the so-called Wagner Group, and they are being deployed without any training in the Ukraine and other countries where Russia is in conflict, before in Syria, and maybe now even in Azerbaijan or Armenia, who knows. And these young men have a very high fatality rate. So within this article, we discuss this concept, and we try to identify this as being a new type of human trafficking, because there is a vulnerability of the young men, and there is an exploitation by the Wagner Group because they don't get paid that much. And when they die, their family doesn't get any state fund, which would normally be the case when a military or a soldier would die operating for the state itself. So the second part are the international conflicts and social threats that we see. And the third one I would like to talk about is technology and the law. And especially talking about the law, it's about the limitations that law has within applying technology because of privacy, for example. So thinking about the international conflicts, we see that we have to talk about situations which create dependency and vulnerability. Well, thinking about your neighbors now, they just finished a very short but very intense conflict, war, so to speak. And we see that a lot of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh will move back to Armenia. They left the situation of relatively poverty, but the situation won't be any better when they move to Armenia, for example. So this makes the migrants very vulnerable for exploitation when they get back. And this exploitation can actually be ongoing, as we also know that a lot of Armenians which are being exploited within the European Union travel through Georgia, more specific Tbilisi. So this is an interesting concept to see in what will happen. So poverty as mentioned, but we also have social exclusion based upon gender, religion, sexual orientation. So we see that in situations where you are, for example, gay or a transgender person, or you have another religion which is not mainstream, you can be a social outcast. You cannot participate in everyday life. Still, you have to make earnings, you have to make an income, you have to have a social life, as COVID-19 has already proved that is a basic need. So this makes you vulnerable for exploitation because there are always people willing to exploit a weakness. So if you're a transgender, desperately looking for attention, there are men and women who are willing to exploit that attention for their own benefits. So next to this, we also see polarization happening. This is very, very visible in my own country at the moment, but for example, also within the United States, where you have two similar groups opposing each other's thoughts on how states should be run and organized. And this could easily explode into something more, making more people vulnerable. All of these elements will lead to some sort of suppression, migration, possibility of smuggling, and we also know that smuggling could go into exploitation. For the ones who are not familiar with the concept of smuggling and exploitation, these are not similar concepts. So smuggling actually is a service rendered, and human trafficking is a exploitation of a person. So smuggling is a concept you've heard of a lot with the Syrian conflict and the EU-Turkey agreements. So smuggling is taking place and it's a service. So I would pay a human smuggler to bring me to another place. This could easily go into exploitation because during the travels, usually the prices go up and up and up, and then I cannot pay, and that makes me vulnerable. And then the smuggler could also start exploiting me by selling me off or letting me do forced labor and so on. So thinking about COVID-19, COVID-19 has been a very interesting concept because it shows the best and the worst of people. And this is what normally a pandemic or a war actually does. And we see that COVID-19 changed the way in how we think about human trafficking because we had a lockdown. And within prostitution, for example, this made it very difficult to buy sexual services. At the same time, these men and women involved within sex work, they are still highly depending on their income. So they change their modus operandi, and also the traffickers change their modus operandi by exploiting their victims more and more online. So we saw an enormous rise in online pornographic materials from Southeast Asia, for example. And in my opinion, a lot of these women and boys involved were actually victims of human trafficking. Well, while I was still in academia, I also used to be an expert within the European Union, evaluating different countries' policies on human trafficking. So I've been involved in Moldova, Lithuania, Hungary, and Romania. And I've been researching the different types of exploitation which are present in those countries. And you also see a lot of interesting links within those post-Soviet relations which remain. So you see some clear links, for example, not only in criminal, but also in social engagement and in military cooperation between Georgia and Moldova, Georgia and Lithuania, Lithuania and Moldova. And the current situation changes the way in that we operate. And for example, for Georgia, the situation in Iran and in Azerbaijan is very interesting to see what it could bring, because we also know that there already are existing criminal relations and criminal networks operating within that region. So it's very interesting to see all the differences occurring within the concept of COVID-19, but also in relation to polarization. And I think that the best example is for possibly the Roma and Sinti, people living in Eastern and Middle Europe. And they are being, well, I would say discriminated against almost everywhere, making them vulnerable for exploitation. And we see a lot of young women ending up in prostitution, and a lot of young men ending up in a criminal life, which may or may not be forced up onto them. So then thinking about technology, and Europol this year stated that technology has broadened criminals' ability to traffic human beings for different types of exploitation. And I could not agree more. So technology offers criminals a perfect base on which they can operate. And at the same time, we see that we are struggling to deal with technology, because technology advances quite rapidly. And it also intervenes, for example, with our personal life. So we see that there is a European need for regulation to protect privacy and limit the possibilities of technology. But at the same time, this limits our possibilities to use technology against human traffickers. So we're always one step behind from a policing point of view. But by limiting the possibilities to apply technology actually sets us back like 4 steps, which makes it more and more difficult to rescue women adequately and timely out of the situation of exploitation. So when we start thinking about technology and we start thinking about this sentence out of Europol, so it broadened the ability to traffic. And how does it broaden the ability to traffic? Well, technology actually offers them a high level of anonymity. In the past, you should be engaged one-on-one. So if we talk about, for example, the lover boy method. So the lover boy method is a situation where you have a guy or a couple of guys grooming a girl. So you have this girl, a little bit shy, not very social, but still in an age that she wants to be involved with other people, get into a relationship. So let's talk about like 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And it's very difficult for the girl to actually engage in normal relationship. And then there's this guy, and he is her knight in shining armor. And he treats her like a princess, and he promises her things, and he gives her gifts, and he takes her out. And he actually is grooming her like we all did when we met our girlfriend or our wife, actually, because then we always treat you like a princess. And in due time, of course, this will go down, but at the start, this is our way to your heart. And as a fact, a lover boy uses the same methodology as we all use as men to conquer women. But we all have different deals with this. So what you see happening is that a lover boy will start a grooming process. And by grooming the girl, he will take her out of her comfort zone and take her away from her social surroundings. So he will distance her from her family, he will distance her from her friends and isolate the girl so she has no alternative. Her life is only with the boy. And then the hatchet falls down. And then he says, well, you know, I love you very much. And I've been buying you gifts, taking you on holidays, and it cost me a lot of money. And now I have an enormous debt and I cannot pay. And I've borrowed some money from some bad people to pay for this. And they will actually hurt me or kill me if I don't pay it back. And then the momentum starts. He actually works the girl. So she will come up, step forward and say, how can I help? And then they will say, well, I have a friend. He's been in love with you for many years and he would like to have sex with you. Are you willing to do so? And then the girl says, no, no, no. And he says, no, I don't want to either, but no. Let's forget we ever talked about this. And then from there onward, he will start influencing her until the girl finally says yes, or actually takes the initiative and says yes. And this is the moment that it happened. And this is a process of weeks, sometimes months. But technology has given them the possibility to limit the moment of grooming to maybe a few hours. So now they don't meet in person, but they meet online. And online, everything goes really fast. So it's like this, we're talking, and then the boy would say, well, I think you're very pretty, and I would like to see much more of you. Can you stand up, show me everything? And then from there, maybe he would ask for a picture from you in bikini, and then he will Photoshop a set of breasts on it. Well, you know it's not your breast. Your parents know it's not your breast, but nobody else will know. And then he starts threatening you. And he will say, well, I'll put a picture online if you don't show me your real breast. And then if you show him your real breast, then he will take a screenshot of those, and then he has new leverage, and then it will go on and on and on. And we have seen cases that within 2 hours, a girl was forced into prostitution by a loverboy 2.0, as we call them. So the anonymity offers people to operate on a different level within a different scale, leaving as little footprints as possible. Next to that, we see that organized crime, for example, uses real-time encrypted communication. So we have PGP phones, we have EncroChat, we have a lot of chats, Wicker, which actually offers anonymity and possibility to communicate within the second. And this also offers the possibility to delete all information shared within a set time frame. Next to this, technology offers the possibility to reach a broader audience. So if I have a girl working for me, which I forced into a life of prostitution, for example, normally I would first call up all my friends and say if they were interested. I don't have to do that anymore. I can just go onto a site, make some pictures, make a nice line of introduction, and then I put her online and let the people call me. And what I mean with this, I'll show later on. So I'm talking now, for example, like websites like Kama. So we have geographical mobility. You don't have to be in a specific area or country to commit the crimes in that country. And you can keep very good control over victims from a distance, making location no longer a dependent factor, as we also see, for example, with website hosting. So the question arises, how can we as law enforcement agencies actually level the technological playing field? So how can we combat these types of crime by using the same methods as criminals use? And luckily enough, we have some possibilities. So even though we're always at least one step behind, we can think on how to counter them. Because what we also know is that a lot of criminals actually work out of a routine activities thought. So if something works, they will continue using those routines and techniques. And this is why we need to know a lot about the history of crime groups and criminals, because it will be a reoccurring way in their operations. And that's something that we can use to actually tackle them. So by using technology, criminals will leave digital footprints. Everything online can be traced. You can never erase everything. And this basically would mean that we as law enforcement agencies would need the best IT people to actually identify and retrieve those digital footprints. At the same time, technology gives criminals a feeling of security. They think that they are invisible and they cannot be touched, maybe because they're in a different country. So you can use these feelings of security by just letting them operate. And the best example I can give you is the EncroChat case, which in Europe has proven its value. So the law enforcement agencies were able to hack into EncroChat. And instead of closing down EncroChat and using the information in the chats between organized crime networks, we just actually decided to stick around and just look and read what was written. And by doing so, we got a lot of information on how networks operated, what relations were there between those networks, and we were able to coordinate different actions against those networks in different countries at the same time. So we were able to cut off the head of the snake. Instead, by starting by the tail, cutting our way up, we now were able to identify the head and cut it off at once, making it very difficult for the criminals to operate and continue working in the way they were used to. And it actually led to a lot of discoveries. So for example, in the Netherlands, it led to the detection of torture chambers within the cocaine mafia. We have enormous drug findings because we knew where the cocaine would arrive, and we were able to dismantle many networks. At the same time, we can also use different communication strategies involving technology. So I've been talking with some friends who are journalists about the possibility of doing a preventive program to reach out to young girls who are possibly or just starting to becoming a victim. And for example, you can use deep fake. So we can make a scene where you can see a young girl walking up, meeting her lover boy, falling in love, having the nice time of her life, and then ending up laying on a bed, having the sixth customer of the evening, a very heavy built guy, hairy, sweaty, moaning, lying above her. And then with deep fake, we can actually make it so that we put the face of the girl onto the actress. So actually it becomes very real. And if we can do this in a setting, for example, if we have a room which we can prepare, we can also use sound, we can use smell. So it's not only about the visuality of seeing your own face lying there, but we can also try to get the real smell of what we call a paaskamertje, so a room in which the sex occurs. So you have a smell of smoke, condoms, sweat, and you can put that in the room. And this is really a way in how to get people aware of what could happen if they continue on this path that they are on right now. So it's also a possibility for us to use technology in a more preventive way. So it's not only about combating, it's also about preventing victims from falling victim. And we can use technology to take over control. So we can actually cut off victims in a direct communication link with their traffickers by just taking away their phones, for example. So we can use a lot of situations in our advantage by limiting the technological possibilities of the criminals themselves. So talking about the fight against human trafficking, which I've been doing quite a lot already, we can see that there are a few risks that we encounter on a daily basis. So as mentioned, human trafficking is a crime with a high level of impunity. It's very difficult to get people convicted. This mostly occurs within legal gaps because the codes holding the information on human trafficking, so the legal codes, we see that it's very difficult to prove a case. And this is mostly because of the EU guidelines. And we already saw the directive, which is very at one hand, very straightforward, but on the other hand, very layered, and it's all needs to be linked to one another. And it's very difficult to bring that into court. Next to this, we see that criminals are quite clever guys in what they do. So they change their modus operandi, they change their networks, they change their relations, and they burn bridges behind them, which makes it very difficult to follow them and identify patterns. Human trafficking still remains a visible crime. So it's a crime without a direct visible victim. And this needs active involvement. So there's a duty obligation not only to provide, but also to obtain information for law enforcement agencies. So we need to be much more proactive, and that's also point 5. Now we just apply reactive policing styles. We wait for victims to come to us, and from there we start our normal way of operating, so information gathering, and from there working upwards. And this should be much more proactive. So if we have some information about human trafficking, we should be on top of it. So we see a lot of human trafficking cases involved with different crimes, for example, cocaine trafficking or weapon trafficking. And it would basically mean in practice that it will never be treated as a human trafficking crime. And therefore it's invisible within, for example, the policing systems. So by being more proactive, having a more proactive way on informing colleagues, but also in gathering information, and for me that's very important as being a researcher and intelligence officer, we can use that information to steer and initiate investigations, and therefore really change the way in how we operate and change the way in how we shape our strategies to fight human trafficking. So in basics, this would mean we have to go from reactive to proactive actions. So we have to actively search for crimes and victims. We have to use a system of data sharing, and this could be on an international level. And I think that that my colleague Gogi can actually work with this as being part of Europol. So this is a key element. We really have to make more use of this, use the Siena system, be more in contact with one another, and know how to find each other. So we also have to seek cooperation with private parties. So we know that banks, for example, have a lot of information about money laundering, which is partly due to the human trafficking monies earned. But we also have people involved as being facilitators. So to identify those facilitators like lawyers, the notary, real estate agents, we actually need to cooperate with their organizations to make it possible to identify them. And as we call it in Dutch, get rid of the rotten apples within society. And we have to make more use of technology. And this is a very difficult element, because talking about technology, it's very, it's dangerous, it's strange, we don't know much about it, and how will we work with it, and is it within the scope of the law? And this is a very difficult concept to actually get implemented within law enforcement agencies. But luckily enough, nowadays there is a change in mindset. So by taking on board the technology, I would like to introduce you into a case study on web crawling. So web crawling is mentioned quite often within human trafficking literature, but there is not much being done on web crawling. So we know that a lot of countries are already using web crawlers, the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, and we also know that Impact, part of Europol, is looking into the possibilities to apply a web crawler as well. And I think this is a very positive element, because I think that a web crawler can be a very positive use of technology for the identification of victims and limiting the time of exploitation and rescuing the victims on time. So human trafficking is a transnational crime, and by its transnational nature, there must be some type of criminal cooperation. Because let's be honest, for me as a Dutchman, it would be impossible to go on a plane, go to Tbilisi, walk around, go online, find a girl, ask her to come with me to the Netherlands, arrange a room in the Netherlands for her to work with, and do the entire scope of human trafficking. This is going to be impossible. So you always need a cooperation. And by just looking at what criminal cooperation is, then you see that it's a cooperation by 2 or more persons with the means to actually commit serious crimes with the aim to make a profit. So that's quite easily understood within a cooperation phase, and especially within human trafficking. So the focus of web crawling now is on sexual exploitation through forced prostitution, because this is one of the elements which is actually quite visible online. And these are some of the websites that I've been using, because I've been using these web crawling, not the techniques, but the idea for like 13 years already. First, I've done manually. Now I use a crawler, which we are developing within the Dutch police. And we can use prostitution as a source of information through the internet. So all the countries, all source countries that we identify from victims in the Netherlands, they uphold some sort of websites. So in the Netherlands, we have, for example, kinky.nl. In Hungary, you have Roslanyok. Romania have Nymphoman. Bulgaria has Top Escort. And in Georgia, you have Kama. So for the ones who've never seen these websites, I'm not quite sure if I click on it that it will automatically share my screen to go to Kama, but otherwise let me know, then I will change the share screen and then I go back to the PowerPoint. Right. You can all see the website? Inga, can you confirm that you can see the website?
No, we can't.
Okay, then I'll just share the screen again. Just a minute.
Okay.
You can see now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
So
yes.
this is the site Kama, which actually has a lot of girls and transgenders posted online. So if we go here, then we see Tbilisi, for example, almost 3,000 unique advertisements, and this is on a normal daily basis. So this is a very, very large site, thinking about the number of people living in Tbilisi, for example. And then you have Batumi as well. But comparing this to other big cities, for example, looking at Bucharest, we have around 1,600 advertisements. Looking at Budapest, we have around 1,000. Kinky.nl Amsterdam has around 600. So thinking about 3,000 unique advertisements, that's a lot. And you can scroll through them endlessly. What I also found very interesting to see is that it changes a lot. So a few years back, you saw a lot of women within their 30s, mostly saying that they were Georgians, posting online. But nowadays, you see a lot more diversity. So age has gone down. To be honest, it's still quite high compared to other countries where you see a lot younger girls, like in their early 20s, applying themselves, soliciting themselves. Usually on Kama, it's around 30. So that's still a difference. But you see a lot more girls from different countries coming up on Kama. So you have a lot of girls from Ukraine. You also have a lot of girls from Russia. You have some girls from Azerbaijan, Armenia, but also from African countries and from Southeast Asian countries. So a lot of girls from Thailand. And this is something that really changed on Kama over the last year and a half or so. So that actually can give us information about changes occurring online, but also within society, for example, of Tbilisi. Well, you can also see by just clicking on the different advertisements. And I won't do so now because it's all in Georgian, and I usually make use of the very handy tool to do it in English, because it's very, very customer friendly, of course, a site like this. And then you can just scroll down and you can see that they're mostly orientated towards specific regions within Tbilisi. So for example, Sabrutalo is one which really is reoccurring a lot. So you have to go into the situation in that specific region and why so many women are actually from that region who solicit themselves online. And you have a lot of different advertisements. They're still active. You can also chat with them. Well, some use Russian, so Cyrillic writing, which indicates possibly that they are not Georgian. So let's try this out. So she's a Ukrainian girl. What you also see happening is that they are very active on social media, so WhatsApp, Viber, but they also have links to specific websites or to Facebook, which they really like to draw people into it. So that you see a lot. You see a lot of information which you can actually use in detecting possible victimization. So now I'll go back to my PowerPoint. So this is just to have a quick view. So please don't call Christina referring to this website. She doesn't know anything about it. So yeah, so not this website, but this presentation and that I'm using this. So please let her have some privacy. So I'll start sharing my screen again for my presentation. So now you have an idea of these websites, and I can use any one of them, but they're quite similar. So you have a picture of a girl with some writing on what is happening, and some information and how you can contact her. So how do we use that process of identifying victimizations by a web crawler? So we first crawl the surface web. This is the first step. So a web crawler only works by putting in the information that you already have on the website. So it's not a web crawler which will automatically scan the entire internet. No, actually, we will only scan around 0.0000002% of the web. And out of that very limited amount, we will only use 0.00005 because that could be relevant information. And after verification, that will come to 0.000000001 of something of the entire internet, which could be of interest to us as law enforcement agencies. And then we'll have to uphold the privacy legislation. So we will crawl the surface web, and we will do so to identify victims. Well, we have a few steps on how this identification process can take place. For example, looking at the possibilities that they offer. So most girls are not very keen in doing very extreme things. So if a girl is available 24/7, offering all types of sex, including anal, common mouth swallowing, rimming, all those extreme elements, those are usually the things that a girl doesn't like and want to do working voluntarily. And especially if it's combined with a very low amount that you have to pay for buying sex, then you know that there is a high possibility of victimization. So once a victim has been identified, we will start a verification process. This actually means that we do an outreach to the girl. So that can either be through a control system, or we can actually go and talk to the girl out of a more scientific process, and then we try to get information to actually identify her as being a victim. Once the girl has been identified as a victim, we can use that as an information position, because then we can find more information on who is responsible for the exploitation, but also who are involved. So who are arranging windows, who are arranging the advertisement, who is arranging payment, who is involved in transfer, for example. And by doing so, by identifying all those different dots in the galaxy, as we call it, then you can identify a prostitution carousel. So that's a possibility because we can identify the travel movements of the girl by using the internet. So now the girl is online on Kama, and we know that by the picture. And she's now in Tbilisi. But then we see her traveling to Batumi. And from Batumi, 2 months later, we see her traveling, going back to Tbilisi. And from Tbilisi, we see her popping up in Budapest, for example. And 3 months later, from Budapest, we see her going to the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, and from Rotterdam to The Hague, and then going back to Tbilisi. So we all have different dots which we can link within a set time frame, and we can use that to identify the prostitution carousel. By identifying a prostitution carousel, we can also start working on identification of network relations, because we know that even though we're talking about organized crime is still mostly locally based. So even though there are international networks, the criminals involved within the exploitation are usually natives working within a specific region, and they don't leave that region, because that's their stronghold. They know how to operate there. As mentioned before, I can go to Tbilisi by plane, but it would be impossible for me to solicit women, to get them working for me in prostitution, to arrange a room, to arrange an advertisement on Kama. I would need help for that. So, and that help would actually make me part of a network, because I need local people. And if I want to transfer them to the Netherlands, I would need the same help back home as well. There should be an extra element on this. So we're now just talking about the surface web. And of course, there is a difference between the surface web, the dark web, and the deep web. So the web crawler now is being used on the surface web, where women solicit themselves through the websites. We also know that on the dark and deep web, there are different elements, different marketplaces, which can also be crawled, but we need an entry. So this is an open entry. We can just put in the website and the web crawler can enter and crawl it. On the dark and deep web, you would need a specific entry code, or you have to buy your way into a marketplace, which makes it much more difficult to actually get involved within those networks. But this is something that we are working on for the future, and I think is a very interesting way to go forward. So just to identify a prostitution carousel, I've used some elements out of my own work. So I've been doing a lot of work in Hungary in the past. And we know that after World War I, Hungary was divided up. So a lot of what used to be Hungary is now part of Romania, but also in Slovakia, Croatia. And we see that a lot of those indigenous Hungarian men and women living in a different country are still traveling within crime networks to back and forth to Hungary. So this shows the different movements within the prostitution carousel, just identifiable through the internet, just by looking at different advertisements. So we see a girl in Page, then she goes to the Balaton region, more specific in Siófok, and from Siófok she goes to Germany, for example. But we also see people from Szeged going to Budapest, Budapest being as the capital, being a real hub for people to leave from. And this is something that you see happening in almost every capitals. So capitals are the main hub in which everybody comes together, and from there will travel forward. So this is also interesting to have a look at. And once they come to the Netherlands, we see the same prostitution carousel going on with direct links to Germany, Belgium, but also people flying in, for example, from Romania or Hungary. And there are direct links between different cities within the Netherlands. And these are cities not all having window prostitution. So this is not all red light districts. So there are still people working from homes, working in escort and different elements. So thinking about those prostitution carousels, you can also start thinking about the criminal networks behind those those prostitution carousels. And when we're talking about organized crime, we usually think about organized crime as being a structure, like the pyramid, like the Italian mafia with a capo di tutti capi, the old way of Toto Riina being the top dog of the Italian mafia, explaining everything to everybody with a set frame of modus operandi. Opposing the more modern way of seeing organized crime as being a more fluid and flexible network of opportunistic relations and and a limited number of people working within a network. And we all know that organized crime as a structure is more easily taken down by the system of follow the money as introduced by the Americans, while organized crime as a network still has no very unified way in how to tackle it. It's mostly opportunistic ways of law enforcement agencies to get information about that network, and therefore it's very important to become more proactive and work on identifying those networks. So for those prostitution carousels, I was able to identify different levels of cooperation. And this is out of my own research, which I've done with Ruth McAllister in 2019, and it can be read in the International Handbook on Human Trafficking. So we can work from local to international. So by just reviewing the situation in the Netherlands, for example, at a red light district, you can easily identify the first level, which are handlers. On top of that, we have the pimps and the caretakers. Then we have the local based bosses, the intermediates, and then we have the kingpins. So what these actually are, so the handlers are men with a lower criminal status, and they are being given menial tasks. So they are responsible for all on-street affairs. So they pick up the girls, they bring them to the windows, they bring food and water to the girls, they also bring cigarettes, condoms, and when needed, they are there at the red light district to support them if they have a conflict with a client, for example. But these are very low-level criminals, and these are usually the only ones we can identify. And this is the ones that we focus upon. So we try to take them out of the equation, hoping that a network will fall down. But this is an illusion. These men are mediocre. They don't really have anything to do with the network. They are just low-level criminals, not of interest. They are just our way in to finding the high-ranking criminals. So on top of them, we have the pimps and the caretakers. These are usually men, but we also see a lot of women working within this position. And these are usually women who started out in prostitution, more or less being a victim, and they work their way up by dating a pimp or dating a higher boss. And they are granted a local unit, and that actually offers them the possibility to get out of prostitution and becoming a madam. So we see that they are running local units within municipalities or within cities, and they usually have several locations on which the victims can work out of. And these pimps are responsible for up to 10 girls at any moment in time, and they arrange accommodation, so where they have to stay, they arrange the advertisement, but they also arrange the escorts, so not bringing the girls to the windows, but bringing the girls to clients' homes and so on. So these are the pimps and caretakers, and these are still very locally based. On top of those pimps, we have the local bosses, and these persons are responsible for supervising several units, and they distribute the women over the units. So, for example, in Rotterdam, there's a city that's a quite big city in the Netherlands. We don't have a red light district, but we do have a lot of women working from homes which are rented out. So these bosses, they arrange those homes where the girls either live, sleep, eat, or work. And they have several of those homes. So if we decide to close a home on criminal code or administrative code, then the same day, 2 hours later, they're working in a different home. And this is something that the bosses arrange. And they are also in higher contact with other bosses from other cities. And this is how they can communicate and exchange women. And this is how you see women traveling around different cities within a country. That being said, we also know that there are marketplaces on the dark web on which you can just offer your girls, you can exchange girls, or you can sell the girls. And from there, they can also go to a different city. And this makes it even more difficult to actually identify network relations, of course, because this is only a financial one, while being in continuous contact and having a regular exchange of women is a more identifiable pattern within a network. So these local bosses usually also work with intermediates, and these are persons or groups operating on a national level who are responsible for arranging the contacts between local-based bosses. So they facilitate the bosses in possibilities and getting the contacts ready. And I'm quite sure that there are a few steps above that as well, but I was unable to identify that by doing my scientific work. I could identify some called kingpins, so the high bosses, and these are the ones they oversee international transport, and they are responsible for entrapping or purchasing women internationally. So I could actually only identify one kingpin within all my research, and it was the Roma Baron of Chisinau, Moldova. And this Baron, the victims came out of his own flock of Roma women, and he would actually be in contact with all the people responsible for the exploitation of these girls far into Europe. And almost all money would flow back to him in Chisinau, where he has a small castle. And this is the only kingpin I could actually identify. So this is one of the old way thinking of the Totarina type networks, which are not the full pyramid, because they are linked to more flexible, smaller networks, but this was all Roma. And they kept it in the Roma style. Well, in my own research, for example, with Roma from Hungary and from the Turkish minority in Bulgaria, I saw that the Turkish gangs would take over the victims in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So that would cut the line with the source country and with their own group and heritage, and they would go into new crime networks responsible for different types of exploitation. So very important to think about is that the intermediates here can also be slumlords, lawyers, notary, estate agents, etc., etc., and they could be seen as the link between under and normal life. So underworld, the criminal world, and everyday life, those people are the links, because they operate on a legal and on a normal level in everyday life, but they also facilitate criminals to participate in everyday life. So in Dutch, we call this the word undermining, but you should think about this as a mole, like the small creature that burrows within the soil. And if you have a garden, you know that they will come up and eat your vegetables from under the ground. But you also know that if you have some towels laying on the floor of your garden and the moles go underneath and their hallways under your towels, make sure that they will collapse. This is what it is. This is what undermining actually is. It offers the possibilities for criminals to get involved in everyday life and influence everyday life, collapsing everyday life. Yeah, it's the best I can explain for now in English, I'm afraid. So what we have to go from is, what we do now is intelligence-led policing. So we find intel, we make it ready for investigations, and we start an investigation. But thinking about human trafficking, thinking about the possibilities of using information on the prostitution carousel, we can also use it from a more predictive statement. So what if we don't use the intel just to start off an investigation right away, but what if we store the information and we work with the information to build a much larger case, like we did with the EncroChat? So then we can actually identify a full network, a full prostitution carousel, and then we can also identify the weak links within those networks. Or we could easily bring in false information in those networks, for example, which creates some sort of mistrust between partners, which will intervene with the way they operate. Or we can take out some key players and then they have to search for new contexts. And that's something that we can bring in an undercover, for example. So there are different ways in how we can use that information, but not only intelligence-led leading to an investigation, but also from a more predictive way of policing, building a much larger case and cutting off the head of the snake as mentioned before. So the prostitution carousel provides us useful information and insights on trafficking routes, existing crime connection and involvement of others, which we need to use within a predictive policing scope. Well, predictive policing is predicting criminal behavior by using large-scale monitoring and data analysis with the goal to prevent crime. So the ultimate goal should be getting rid of the entire network, and by doing so, making sure that no new girls will become a victim of that network. Well, the core element within this approach is the recognition of patterns in human behavior which are frequent, regular, or just the opposite, which stand out. So this is very technical, very difficult, and I won't bore you too much with this, but what you need to know is it's visible. We can identify it by using a set of indicators to identify those patterns. And they are being weighed and scaled, and by applying the proper weighing, we can actually use that information as a solid way to build a case. So then what's next? So we now know that web crawling is coming up. There are some difficulties with web crawling, mostly within privacy legislation. And of course, the EU now has the new e-privacy regulations coming up, which actually prohibits private, but also law enforcement agencies to work with web crawlers unless there is a solid legal foundation within their own criminal code. And this is something that a lot of countries have to work upon. Otherwise, we cannot continue using the technology. So for the Netherlands, it's on hold right now until this has been taken care of. So, but what's next? So we can apply the web crawler, for example, with artificial intelligence. So we make it a system which more easily could scale up or scale down the information without human interference. We can use machine learning. So the machine can actually learn from the mistakes and become a better product. So we have the source code and we have the software layers, and by machine learning, it can operate the software by itself. We can have a focus on dark web crawling, as mentioned before. And we're also testing facial recognition to have more positive hits. So we've seen on Kama, you have a lot of pictures of girls. Well, if there's a face, it's beautiful because then we can put the face in storage and then we can scan all the websites and get a hit with the face. And that's the most perfect hit you can have, because then you will get into the 80% hits, and those are beautiful, but quite rare. Usually we have hits like 40%, which are feasible. So facial recognition could help us a lot, but then we also have object recognition. So a lot of the girls in the pictures, they had some sort of tattoo. And a tattoo is an object on somebody's body, which we can actually use to identify the girl in another picture. I've also been talking to plastic surgeons because apparently all physical bodies, they have some symmetry and some measurements guidelines, which also can be used within artificial intelligence and machine learning as a learning system on how to identify a person. So not all bodies are symmetrical. So you have one bigger breast than another, and this can actually help identify a possible victim in a different picture from a different side. But we can also use the situation when a picture has been taken in front of a window and we can see a church in the background. So we can identify the object by using object recognition, and then we can combine that with Google Maps, and then we can find the direct location. And by using some mathematical programs, we can actually identify the exact location of a building or a apartment or a room where the picture actually was taken. And this can help us a lot, because then we know which networks, which criminals are responsible for those locations. So as mentioned, we need data sharing coalitions between the public and private sector. And on the basis should always be a continuous, well-organized international police cooperation between different countries, informing us on victims and criminals like traffickers who are coming in and out of the countries, leaving with girls. So this all is supporting information that we can use to actually positively identify those networks. So this is one of my final slides. If you're interested in the topic and you would like to know more about human trafficking or what the EU is doing against human trafficking, here are some interesting reads you can have to broaden your scope and get more interest into the topic. And this is my final slide. So I would first like to thank all of you for participating. It's very good for me to see that there's a lot of interest in Georgia for the topic, and people are so interested in hearing me talk. And you should always remember, by fighting crime, we have common goals, we have joint responsibilities. And so please let us work together. And I really don't mind if it's on which level it is. It's always very important. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. I'm open for a nice discussion if you want to.
Thank you, Mr. Iorn. So if you have the questions, yeah, you can put Mr. Iorn. So he's ready to answer. Mr. Iorn, our Dean of Law Faculty has several questions. Actually, I can put it instead of him. It's okay, yes?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay. So the first question is, how has the pandemic changed the tendencies in the spread of trafficking and the ways of fighting it?
Well, for the Netherlands, I can say that we had a lot of Romanian networks operating nowadays within the Netherlands. And we see that a lot of the victims within those networks actually left the country. So they went back to Romania. And we also see that they found different ways to operate. So a lot more became online. Mm-hmm. And we now see that the networks are reestablishing themselves, bringing in new girls, for example, through Italy, through Spain, up to the Netherlands. So they really had a drawback in their operations. But ever since that we opened up the windows and the field of prostitution again, we see slowly that the girls are finding the way back to the Netherlands. We also see that some of the girls stayed here and they were being exploited in different ways. So, for example, in households or in other types of labor exploitation.
Okay, thank you, dear Iorn. Please raise your hands in just application. Show please that you want to put the questions in the application of Zoom.
So შეუძლიათ ხმა ჩართონ და დასმონ კითხვა.
If you want, you can also ask it in Georgian, then Inga or somebody else can translate if you're more comfortable by doing that. Inga, you're still on mute.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. I want to ask one very interesting question for me. The fighting against human trafficking is a very important issue for protection of the human rights. And now you were talking about the role of the law enforcement agencies, but I'm interested what is the role of the CSOs, NGOs, or media or society against the fighting for the human trafficking. And also I have one other questions about the transparency of the process, the process of investigations and other measures against human trafficking, and how the transparency of this process and awareness raising may play an important and positive role in this process.
Okay, thank you. Very, very good question. So I think that the role of NGOs and non-state partners are very interested, because are very, very important, and for law enforcement agencies are also very interested, even though they have probably different goals within the fight against human trafficking. But NGOs, we cooperate quite intensely with NGOs. So we have the Center Against Human Trafficking and Child Abuse in the Netherlands, for example. We have the National Rapporteur, we have Comencia, we have a lot of NGOs working in this field, and they are in good coordination with the police, for example. But I think that NGOs are very important, as you already mentioned, for raising awareness, for giving victim support, taking care of referral of victims to their countries. So this is very important, and the cooperation is quite okay. I know in different countries it's different, so it really differs in which country you're at. And what, for example, as mentioned by you, for the process and the transparency of the actual investigations by the police, these are mostly not visible for non-police partners. And even within cooperation on an international level, we still have to be very careful, because sometimes you have a case running with a different country, but you're not at the same moment in time on evidence gathering, for example. So you have to hold your own cases until the other country is ready and at the same stage. Otherwise, you would intervene within a network in one country, and then it can restore itself in another country. And of course, you want to make sure that the network is damaged so intensely or so badly that it cannot recover from the blow that you gave it. Because if you hurt it, it will grow back, and it will grow back stronger. At the other hand, when you hurt it, it will also give possibilities for further investigation, because they will have to search for new ways of operating. And in that search of new ways, they will make mistakes, and those mistakes are visible for us as well. But in general, it's not very it's not very transparent process, except for the police agencies involved. And it also depends if it's an investigation only orientated to one specific unit, for example, the unit of The Hague where I'm working, or it became a national problem, and then it goes to another town called Zwolle, where we have the national unit on human trafficking and an intel cell on human trafficking, and they will take over. And they will coordinate communication, also with foreign partners, for example, with Gogi.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And our law faculty dean, Mr. Givilobjanidze, who is here now, has another question. Dear Iorn, would you be interested to cooperate in making joint scientific article publication on this topic?
Oh yeah, sure, no problem.
With our professors.
Yeah, sure, no problem. More than happy.
Okay.
But I would, thank you. So I would like to question. I have a question for all of you, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been talking about human trafficking, and I've been talking about prostitution and Kama. So I'm quite interested. How many of you actually were aware of the problem of human trafficking within your own, well, not country, your city or municipality, or within your own social community, but also if you were aware about websites like Kama and what your views towards those websites actually are?
თარგმნო ბატონო გივი. გითარგმნოთ კითხვა თუ პასუხებს და მე ვთარგმნო? მე მგონი კითხვა გავიგეთ, ხო? აი, რამდენად გაცნობიერებული გქონდათ და გაქვთ, თქვათ, ამ პრობლემის არსებობა თქვენს ქვეყანაში, თქვენს უბანში, თქვენს ირგვლივ აი ესეთი კითხვა. Anybody can answer. ყველა შეუძლია რომ ვისაც სურს უპასუხოს.
ან თუ ვიცით მსგავსი შემთხვევები?
აი რამდენად თქვენ ციცით და რამდენად გაცნობიერებული გაქვთ ეს?
Well, particularly in Georgia, you're talking about, right?
Yes. So specifically your own position within the country as being a student or a practitioner.
So I've seen many cases actually in Georgia, in Tbilisi. I even know from my friends' friends. Well, I don't have, I don't keep in touch with them, but I've seen some pictures like you shared before, and I would say it's really, really big problem here.
Okay, thank you. Because you're all aware of the legal situation in Georgia surrounding prostitution, yes?
Yes, and it's really like confidential because everybody is afraid not to like know, and everybody who does that, in my opinion, they are really afraid that the police will like find out, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's really illegal here, but mostly people do that.
Yeah, so what you see happening in Georgia, what I understood about some of the people from the ministry, it's that it's legally is prohibited, but in practice there's a regulation in which the women involved or the transgenders involved within the prostitution process are actually not punishable, or they won't be punished. And unless there are minors involved, then it becomes a really different case. But thinking about the three different prostitution policies, there are websites in every country. Even in the Nordic regions where we have the Nordic model, there are still websites where women can solicit themselves. Actually, this is not forbidden. A girl can become a prostitute in Sweden, and she can put an advertisement in a newspaper. That's all fine. Me as a man,
Oh,
I
that
just
is not
cannot.
punished. It does not require any punishment.
No, I'm going to be punished by law if I buy sex. So they change the way of thinking. They say women are always victims, and therefore they need protection. And the men who buy sex are the actual predators, and they need to be punished. So therefore, it's free for a girl to decide to work as a prostitute, and she can do so, and she can receive customers. But if there's going to be a police check, then the man who's present there is actually seen as a trafficker. So he's punishable by law, not the girl. She will get support.
Yes, but in
No.
here, as I know, many are afraid because they say that it is a very big punishment for what they do. For example, for instance, like I would say about webcams, if you know, that kind of things, you know, it's really punishable for them, as I know.
Yeah, and this makes it, if they feel like this, I think it's very sad, because that makes it very difficult to actually identify victims and give them the possibility to exit a life of exploitation and prostitution, which is not the same. And you always have to decide whether it's a victim or it's a girl voluntarily working in prostitution. And then you can have a very polarized black or white debate on if a girl can ever enter prostitution voluntarily. So this is the abolitionist discussion, but this is a different scope. But I think it's a very good thing is if a government can reach out to women working in prostitution and give them support, also for exiting prostitution, because it's very difficult once you started a life in prostitution to actually exit prostitution, because you get so used to the lifestyle by making quite a lot of money in a certain way that you can never go back, for example, to McDonald's flipping hamburgers. At the same time, it's very difficult to get a normal job, because on your resume, you will have a gap and nobody will say, oh, I've worked as a prostitute for 4 years, so I have very good people skills and I can work very well with men. That's not something that will help you get a job later on. So it's a very difficult concept and line of work, even in the Netherlands, where it's legal but still very stigmatized. So it's still that women working as a prostitute, not all of them can actually step forward and go to their parents and say, hey, I'm mom, dad, I'm a prostitute, and it's being accepted. So that's still a very difficult concept. And if it's even worse, if the government doesn't recognize possible victimization, then you will have a very, very big task of getting help there and also getting information out of the possible networks related to those victims.
I have one question.
Sure.
So you said that there are some countries that it is not forbidden, right? And it's legal. But what would you say about things that when there are some countries that it's really illegal and there's some kind of punishment, like where do these victims end up? Like, do they end up in jail or are they deported or something?
Well, let's take the United States, for example. So the United States has a system of full prohibition, some states at least. And that would basically mean that if you're a victim and you're being made a drug addict and you're being forced to work on the street as a prostitute and the police will catch you, you will go into jail. And then you're seen as a criminal as well. So they will actually try to rescue you by punishing you. And this is the only system I cannot live with. I think this is a terrible system. And that's something why I'm very opposing the tip report, because the tip report is not very objective in some of the ways they perceive prostitution and the prostitution policy. So, but the United States for me is an example, especially those states where everything is prohibited, where dealing with victims is very wrong. So they are not giving the support, they are not giving the respect needed as being a victim so they can get help. So I think that victims should receive the adequate aid that they need.
So it is normally a crime, as I understood.
Well,
in some places.
In the United States it is, and if even in the Netherlands, if you don't work with a permit from your home, it's still a crime to work as a prostitute. So it's even in the systems where it's regulated, because legalization means that everything is okay. So even in systems where it's regulated, you can still see that there are a lot of difficulties and possibilities to work not in accordance with the law, not making you a criminal, but you're breaking the law.
So you're saying that the USA is the most common place, right? The most popular cases are there, because as I know, California constantly has the highest human trafficking rates, basically in the United States. And they have approximately 1,000 and I don't know, like 400 or 500 cases reported last year.
Yeah, but that's those numbers are very difficult because California is one of the biggest states inhabited wise as well. And for example, if you look at the EU, the Netherlands is always in the top 3 with the number of victims of human trafficking. That's not because we have so many victims of human trafficking. That's because we have a clear and open way of dealing with data. So we store all the data, we recognize it, and we have a very active National Rapporteur's Office who actually is very open on the data and shares the data. So it looks like we have a very big number of human trafficking victims, but actually compared to other countries, it's almost the same. It's just about the fact that we use all the data and we share all the data.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Mr. John, I have one question.
Sure.
Do you think that our judges, lawyers, and prosecutors must have special trainings to struggle against this crime, and they must be licensed to struggle against this crime and to have special trainings?
To be honest, I don't know the specific situation in Georgia on lawyers, law enforcement, and judges, but I think that raising awareness and knowledge on the crime of human trafficking and looking at all the different aspects and difficulties surrounding the crime, these trainings are very good to have. And I know that in the Netherlands we had the same discussion, and we have trained our judges, and we have a a specific national prosecutor on the topic, who cooperates with the police. We have specific departments within the police, but it remains quite difficult to get everybody thinking the same way, accepting evidence, for example, because we see that a lot of victims, they actually deal with post-traumatic stress syndrome and other psychological problems, and therefore their statements are very strange. And sometimes they differ from time to time. So on moment A, they say this, on moment B, they say something different, and in court, they say something different again. So for a normal person, this would be a lie. But looking at the perspective of this being a victim, being raped several times a day for months in an end, having to deal with those traumatic experiences, the memory reoccurs, it changes. So giving support in witness statements or in victim statements with the help of a psychiatric person or a psychologist, and having judges accepting that, that is a really big gain. But also with lawyers. We see lawyers in the Netherlands who actually try to re-victimize victims, or to relive the victimization itself by the questions they ask. I think this is not done. It doesn't necessarily need to be part of the job description of a lawyer. You need to make sure that your client has a fair trial and support your client, but it's not your doing to let a victim relive victimization again. So I think that there's still a lot of training needed to actually deal with these type of victims. But also from a police perspective, we need specific ways in how to interview those victims and get information.
Thank you.
Which we can actually use. So sometimes we don't do that at the right way. And these are all training processes that we have and learning curves, and we're working with this. So I support your statement that this is very much needed, but for the Georgian situation, I'm not aware of any of it, so I cannot say anything, to be honest. But maybe one of my colleagues can fill this in.
I have one question.
Sure.
Given the current challenges, are there any plans to develop new norms on trafficking in international law?
Well, it's changing always. So there are some renewals on the way that we perceive human trafficking. One is in the literature list, actually, which is in the PowerPoint. But it also changes in learning. So we see new social phenomena occurring, and then we have new ways of human trafficking occurring. So it's not necessary to actually put it in new legislation, because looking at the EU Directive and the UN Protocol, it already holds the elements of, as mentioned before, the what, how, and why, which is supportive enough. So it holds a lot of human behavior and a lot of types of trafficking already within it. And it's only up to countries to make sure that that's already covered. And you can do so by jurisprudence, by bringing it to court, or by changing the law. You don't need a UN or EU change, I think.
Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.
Can I ask you one last question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So as it seems, it is a very common problem in California, as we said, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do we resolve this issue? I mean, as I know, in 2011, California passed a law, right, to help with trafficking this problem in the manufacturing industry. And as it was said, the law required major manufacturing and retail firms to disclose what they were doing, just to stop this problem in human trafficking. So why and how do we resolve this problem in the future?
Well, to be honest, I think we can't. It's impossible. We can limit it, but you can never eradicate it. So that's something we have to be aware of. And what we see happening now is that the supply chain is becoming more and more of interest within the concept of human trafficking, also in raising awareness. Because I think most of you all have a smartphone. Your smartphone has some very rare earth elements in it, deriving out of Africa. and probably they are being dug up by children's hands, or your phone is being manufactured in China in a factory where there is not they are not upholding all labor rights as we would like to see it. So going in the supply chain is very difficult to get anything without a link to exploitation and human trafficking. But there's awareness, and luckily enough, more and more companies within the private sector are getting aware of the problems, and sometimes they need some incentive, like banks. So the banks were quite reluctant to act upon money laundering and human trafficking, but then we started by giving them fines running up to sometimes billions, and now they're really keen on getting everything done, and they really want to fight human trafficking. So sometimes it happens because companies get a new insight, or they get involved, or they see the light, and sometimes they need some more incentives by just poking them a little bit in the right direction. So, but luckily enough, the last few years, you see a lot of good initiatives coming up with great plans, people giving attention to it, also in the United States with Ashton Kutcher, for example. So those are very good elements in the development to fight human trafficking.
And what do you think is the age of starting this problem? I mean, this job.
Victim? Well, it depends on as a victim, you mean?
I mean, no, like what age does human trafficking start, basically? Like
as a perpetrator or as a victim?
Well, both sides, I guess.
But it highly depends on which country you're in and what type of exploitation. So if we use a Western view on child labor exploitation, and you compare that to Nepal or India, then it's very strange, because children start working at the age of 4 in India sometimes. But that's life, how it is there. So we evolved as a society in the West. So we don't want children to work at a very young age, but we shouldn't uphold our views on different countries at a different time frame and with a different cultural background. So this makes it very difficult to discuss the concept of human trafficking. But thinking out of a Western perspective, I've seen examples of young Roma girls in Middle Europe being forced into prostitution since the age of 5. We see 5, yes.
Wow.
So we see lover boy methods running from 12 up to 16, but we also see adults being forced. And again, with the traffickers itself, within the Roma community, we've seen that brothers and nephews were involved, who were also just children, aged 8 or 9. But usually within the Netherlands, talking about the lover boy situations, we're talking about guys in their 20s.
So just to sum up, in conclusion, some people just, they choose themselves, right? If they want to do it, and some are forced.
Well, no. I think within the victims, there's always a force. So there's always a type of exploitation which requires one of the elements mentioned within the EU Directive. So then you would have the means, the how. And for perpetration, sometimes it's just a way of life. But you have a lot of criminological theories on why people become criminals, and it really depends on the personal situation of a person, I think. Which situation was dependent or was predominantly present.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
More questions? So I have one question.
Sure.
Okay, so I'd like to just, if you have the statistics, do victims always come from low income or poor background of the families, or just different backgrounds, or do you keep such kind of statistics?
Yeah, we keep statistics, but again, with privacy legislation, we cannot, for example, have statistics on cultural background. So we know that we have in the Netherlands, our prime group of victims are Dutch. So they have the Dutch nationality. But then again, if we look at that group, there are not indigenous Dutch. So we have within that group a lot of girls whose parents are from Turkey or Morocco or Suriname, but we are not allowed to keep track of that information.
Okay, thank you.
But in general, we can say that the more vulnerability there is, the more prospect of becoming a victim. So yes, usually they have some issues. It's very rarely a very rich girl in their 20s who becomes a victim. It's usually a very deprived, social, inadequate, a little bit younger girl with no social supervision.
Thank you. And one more question.
Yeah, sure.
I have to you. And are there the cases, and how often does it happen that the victims identify themselves, self-identify as the victims of trafficking and ask for help immediately or after some time?
Well, it depends on the situation. So I think that a lot of victims don't see themselves as being a victim. But you also have cases in which the girls instantly know that they are a victim. So these are the cases where you have abduction, for example. So if a girl is being abducted and she's being forced into a life prostitution, then she still knows that she's a victim. And the girls who are being lured to the Netherlands saying, well, you can become a maid in a household and then you have to work in prostitution, they know that they are a victim. But a lot of girls already involved in prostitution in the native country, and then they go work in prostitution in the Netherlands, for example, they don't see themselves as being victim.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So any other questions?
No questions. Thank you for very interesting lecture, for very interesting training.
Indeed.
Okay, more than welcome.
So thank you to all participants that you joined us and listened with such an interest. So it is not surprising because dear Jorn, you really gave us masterclass, really great performance. Thank you once more. Thank you to our guests, special guests as well from Hague, Mr. Gogi Gafaria, that you attended our class. And I hope for the future cooperation, but I would say that I would hope for face-to-face communication in future in Georgia or in Netherlands. So I think everything will come back soon and we will have the chance to cooperate and communicate better.
Let's hope so. So thank you very much for the invitation. It was my delight to talk to you, and hopefully you've learned something and you can take it up and take it back and discuss it. So raise more awareness of the issues, and that will also help.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorn.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I definitely need to say very shortly and express our huge appreciation to you, Jorn, and also appreciation to the administration of the university in this case, because from the Georgian police perspective, to say it shortly, the awareness of the society is one of the most effective and important tools to combat the organized crime and not just trafficking of the human beings. But in this case, unfortunately, this becomes one of the most organized problematic police fields, to say so, in Georgia. So I'm very glad that we see the involvement of the younger generation, and we really hope that together with the society, we all would be involved in order to tackle and realize the problem that we have. And definitely need to say that the legislation changes are going to be very important in order to give it the proper face and once again to see the problem in depth, because we've had the conversations before with you, Jorn, and just like you mentioned, we do realize the problem, but unfortunately we don't have the proper and effective tools also from the legislational side to take care of the problem and to realize that most of the people involved in this are victims. So I very much hope that the situation, there will be institutional changes in the way we approach this problem in Georgia.
Well, if I can be of support, just let me know.
Oh, absolutely. We most definitely will, sir.
Okay.
Thank you very much once again. Inga, ძალიან დიდი
Thank
მადლობა
you.
მოსვევისთვის. მე ბოდიშ ღირთი პასიური მონაწილეობისთვის ამ შემთხვევაში ხომ
არა, როგორ გეკადრებათ?
ექსპერტი არა ვარ, ნამდვილად აქედან გამომდინარე.
პირიქით თქვენ რომ ჩაგვერთეთ, დიდი მადლობა.
ძალიან დიდი მადლობა თქვენ.
და ვიმედოვნებ რომ მომავალში ვითანამშრომლებთ.
ძალიან დიდი სიამოვნებაა. ძალიან დიდი მადლობა.
დიდი მადლობა რომ დაგვითმეთ დრო.
წარმატებები. მადლობა თქვენ.
ჯანმრთელობას გისურვებთ. Stay negative for the virus and positive to life. დარჩით უარყოფითი ვირუსის მიმართ და დადებითი ცხოვრების მიმართ. So we'll end with just optimistic notes. Goodbye. Thank you, Iorn, once more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you again
Thanks
soon,
for
Georgia.
such interview. Thank you. Goodbye.